The following excerpts are just a few from scientists worldwide who confirm that reducing meat consumption is the single most effective thing an individual can do.
Reducing our meat is probably the single most effective thing that individuals can do immediately to reduce their greenhouse gas impact.
It would be one of the silver bullets, really. It would be very good for the planet.
On a personal basis, perhaps the most important thing you can do is change your diet to a more vegetarian diet, because that is a major contributor to not only carbon dioxide but also methane and other greenhouse gases.
We could definitely have a significant dent on those agricultural greenhouse gas emissions if people consume less livestock products in the diet.
Meat consumption globally needs to come down. The evidence seems to point to that unequivocally. Animal production is going to have to come down.
Definitely an absolute phasing out of factory farming and a minimizing of meat eating.
Now that's actually true. By reducing your meat consumption, you can make a difference, and it's even good for your health.
Scientific research has shown that climate change is occurring more quickly than the worst-case scenarios put forward by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, just a few years ago. Thus, many scientists and politicians realize it is imperative that we reduce the planet's temperature as expeditiously as possible. In the past, efforts to mitigate global warming have focused almost exclusively on lowering carbon dioxide emissions. But we know now that although reducing CO2 is critical, even if the entire world switched to a zero-carbon economy and lifestyle today, it would take thousands of years for this gas to dissipate. Some scientists and politicians are realizing that limiting shorter-lived greenhouse gases such as methane and ozone and other contributors to warming such as black carbon, also known as soot, released into the air from burning biomass and fossil fuels are where major gains in slowing the heating of the Earth can be made in a swift amount of time. As one climate scientist says, we need to reduce short-lived greenhouse gases today in order to ensure a livable planet for our children, and we need to reduce CO2 to ensure a livable planet for generations a few hundred years from now. Limiting these gases, particularly methane, is relatively inexpensive and rapid, whereas many of the technologies to reduce CO2 are either in their infancy or are costly and time-consuming to integrate into the current infrastructure. Scientific understanding of the role of livestock in accelerating global warming has increased as well. Some researchers are beginning to recognize that livestock contributes much more to global greenhouse gas emissions than the 18% estimated by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization 2006 report, Livestock's Long Shadow. This report states that livestock raising is the #1 source of human-caused methane. Methane, in turn, contributes to the creation of ozone. As livestock production and cultivating feed for these animals are both responsible for over 70% of rainforest destruction in the Brazilian Amazon, shifting to a plant-based diet can reduce black carbon particles landing on the ice, such as Antarctica or the Andean glaciers, by ending the forest burning done to clear space for farming and cattle grazing. We will begin by hearing what some of the world's top climate scientists and those in other scientific fields have to say about the urgency of quick action to halt climate change, and then learn current information about the role of short-term greenhouse gases in lowering the Earth's temperature.
It's hard for people to realize this because you don't notice much happening. Global warming is about 1 degree Celsius. And weather variations are much larger than that from one day to another. So you don't notice that there's a crisis, but in fact, we are at a crisis point now because we are very close to passing tipping points in the climate system that would have very undesirable consequences. In fact, we've actually passed one tipping point, and that's the Arctic Ocean. We've already reached a point where we're going to lose all of the ice in the Arctic Ocean.
We're already seeing record temperatures around the world, and with it, we're seeing species going extinct, we're seeing sea levels rise and coastal flooding, we're seeing spreading diseases, and we're seeing more extreme weather. What we're seeing now is just the beginning of what's predicted if we let things get worse.
The IPCC, the UN Climate Panel, got it right. I mean, basically, operating on data that is now 4 or 5 years old, they made predictions about what the Earth system, what the climate system would look like in the future. Now we have something like 4 or 5 years more data, and it turns out that we're on their worst case trajectory, or the worst case scenario that they defined, or maybe even worse.
While we knew a lot of things were changing, we've come to realize that they're actually changing much faster than we thought before. So we have much less time to actually act.
Certainly, we are threatening sustainability in the long run. Climate change is making fundamental changes to part of the system that we are totally dependent on. I am talking about ecosystems, both on land, terrestrial ecosystems, and also in the ocean, marine ecosystems. We are melting glaciers, which will affect the water supply to billions and billions of people, which will have to move because people don't live where there are no water. So we are creating or making a setup for social conflict on a grandiose scale. So very much threatening the sustainability of the globe.
I have to say that some ecosystems are going to be impacted in a very serious way very soon, and we have to do all what we can to curb climate change in order to avoid such huge damages which will put at risk our well-being, the well-being of humans.
So who wants to take this kind of gamble with a laboratory called Earth? This is a gamble we cannot afford to lose.
Yeah, we're really running out of time. In fact, I think this next year or 2 years are the critical time period.
I certainly think unless we turn off the taps tomorrow, the world is going to continue to warm. We don't want that warming to run away, and so we have to do something about it. It will require changes in all of the greenhouse gases. There are about 6. Methane is one, CO2 another, nitrous oxide and some others.
Some 25 years ago, when the first IPCC report was done and the first meeting was held in Rio, the Earth Summit, climate change seemed very far away. And the big actor in the long term, of course, is carbon dioxide. But now that climate change is much more upon us, and we're already seeing major impacts, ecological impacts, particularly melting of glaciers, and the sea ice disappearing, and so on, we're realizing that it's not so far away and that we have to think about the immediate term as well as the long term. The science has also progressed substantially, and we understand now that there are some shorter-lived pollutants, greenhouse pollutants, that have an effect on climate in the shorter term. It's certainly true that in the long term we have to deal with carbon dioxide, but in fact, when I think about it for myself, the only way I can have an impact on the planet's warming in my lifetime is to deal with these shorter term things. Anything I do with CO2 may have an effect, but it won't have it for many, many years.
Because the carbon dioxide that we put in the atmosphere will stay there, much of it, for more than 1,000 years.
And yet, the shorter-lived things, methane is the most important of which, but is not the only one, actually have bigger impact on warming today than CO2 itself. And the fact that they're shorter-lived means that if what we do now can have an immediate effect. So being short-lived makes them more important, particularly if there are things we can do quickly to reduce them. And one of the problems with CO2 is that many of the things we need to do are very difficult, expensive. It's intrinsically tied up with our energy systems, and energy is so important for every aspect of life. Rich countries, run on fossil energy. Poor countries want to use more fossil energy because they need to develop. We need to learn how to reduce these things, but it's not going to be simple or cheap. On the other hand, these shorter-lived things, like methane, some people have called low-hanging fruit. That is, they're available for us now with relatively smaller costs. And so that's another argument for methane, is that we can do something in the shorter term, and it's easier than with CO2.
So methane, I think of its lifetime in the atmosphere, which is about 8 years. And that means that if you emit methane today, in 8 years, you'll have roughly about a third of it left. That's relatively short-lived relative to some other greenhouse gases. And the reason that's exciting is if we were to make an effort to reduce methane emissions, that would be very quickly reflected in the atmosphere. That methane isn't hanging around as long as, say, a molecule of nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas. So if we make the effort to reduce methane emissions, that will have a quick impact on the radiative forcing of the atmosphere, and the thinking being that that can buy us some time as we try to get, carbon dioxide under control. Having said that, the more time that passes and we talk about it and we don't do it, we do run out of time for the other greenhouse gases.
There are many things that people can do to reduce their emissions. If you eat further down on the food chain rather than animals which have produced many greenhouse gases and used much energy in the process of growing that meat, you can actually make a bigger contribution in that way than just about anything. So that's, in terms of individual action, is perhaps the best thing you can do.
Dr. Kirk Smith, a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and a member of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, strongly advocates reducing our methane footprint.
Can you go through some of the math of global warming decay?
Well, let's look at the graph here. That's from the IPCC. And this is one of the most important single graphs in the IPCC documents. It shows the amount of warming from the different pollutants. At the top is CO2, that long red line, and we won't talk about the units, but this illustrates the amount of warming that's occurring in this particular year, 2005. But look at the next one. The next one is methane. It's more than half of the CO2. And then you go down the list there's carbon monoxide and black carbon. When you start adding those in, makes the non-CO2 gases actually more important than CO2. So it's not that CO2 isn't important, and everybody think that's the case. It's just that why not also consider these other things, particularly when we make changes in them, we get an immediate benefit. With CO2, it takes a long time. This shows the amount of decay of methane. You put CO2 and methane in the atmosphere, I think this is for the year 2008. How much is left? Natural processes remove it, fortunately, from the atmosphere. Otherwise, we'd really be in trouble. But we're just putting in pollutants faster than they can be naturally removed. And so you can see that in the first few years, the CO2 actually comes out faster than methane. But then CO2 its removal slows down, and you can see the blue line there is higher than methane after 10 years. And then if you look at over a 100-year period, you can see that after 100 years, hardly any of the methane we release today is in the atmosphere in 100 years. A considerable amount of the CO2 we release today is in the atmosphere in 100 years.
Reducing methane has another benefit in that ground-level ozone is a short-lived greenhouse gas created in part by methane.
The other side of it is that methane reductions have other benefits that CO2 does not have. Methane is more damaging, for example, than CO2 for climate, and also produces other problems, including the creation of ozone in the atmosphere. Many people get confused. There's ozone in the stratosphere, that's way, very high up in the air. We want to protect that ozone. That's good ozone, if you will. And methane has no impact on that. But methane has an impact on creating ground-level ozone, so-called tropospheric ozone in atmospheric science terminology. It's like smog in LA, or smog in Houston, or smog in Mexico City. And it's bad for health, and it damages plants, damages animals. One of the causes of that ozone is methane emissions.
And ozone's the number 3 greenhouse gas after CO2 and methane in terms of human contributions to the enhanced radiative forcing of the atmosphere, meaning if you add up methane and ozone, they're having about half the impact as CO2. So these minor greenhouse gases We think about CO2 a lot, but methane together with ozone really are packing a punch as well.
Would lowering methane emissions have an impact on reducing ozone so as to produce rapid planetary cooling?
The global warming we're seeing today, and likely to be seeing in the near future, is primarily from other gases, mainly methane. So we need to address these sources, and the number one source of methane emissions is animal agriculture. That's the most powerful source we can address to reduce the global warming we're seeing today.
Dr. Kirk Smith discusses various sources of methane and states that because livestock is the single largest human source of this gas, eating lower on the food chain is the most effective way to lower our methane footprint.
Most of us don't see the methane that we produce. It's one step removed. But we still produce, each of us, a lot of methane by our activities, one step removed. Some of us might produce methane if we had, say, some kind of a pit in the backyard that was filled with garbage or something might produce methane. But where do we produce our methane? We produce it through our sewage, through the landfills where our garbage goes, through the leakage in the natural gas pipelines that supply our houses, through the emissions of methane from coal mines and where they mine our coal to power our power plants, and from animals, livestock. The biggest single source of human-caused methane emissions is livestock.
On the pie chart, a large section of the contributing factors has to do with the raising of livestock.
That's right.
So switching to a meat-free or vegetarian diet, how might that impact us on a global level and help us reduce the methane, thereby slowing down the process of global warming?
Already, livestock is 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions. The meat system includes the animals, includes growing the food for the animals, includes the transport of the meat, includes the fertilizer to grow the food, to feed the meat. There was a recent article last fall in Lancet, the famous medical journal, that laid this all out, showing that, and that's with not treating methane any more than the sort of normal way it's used. If you treat it more, if you worry about it a bit more, as we were talking about a minute ago, then that 20% will go up to maybe 30%. So the 30% in the next 20 years is going to be due to meat production. So there is something that an individual can do. Most of us aren't growing our own meat, but when you pick out that slab of meat from the Safeway, you are in a sense turning on the whole system that creates it. Just as you turn on the electricity in your house, you're turning on the power plant.
So then by simply purchasing any of these meat products, people are indirectly contributing to increase in methane.
That's right, methane, and then in the whole operation of the meat system. How are we going to get people to eat less meat? It's going to take a lot of effort, of the media, like yourselves, and maybe schools, to get at this. Now, I mean, myself and my wife, we were heavily influenced by our daughter, who's been vegetarian since 6th grade, and when she's home, we're completely vegetarian. But my wife and I, we're moving toward that state.
We need to decrease the amount of methane that we're putting up. And one way is to become vegetarian. It really, truly makes a difference.
Methane is like carbon on steroids. It's dozens of times worse than CO2. And then black carbon is hundreds of times worse.
Meeting of the committee will please come to order. Today's hearing will focus on the issue of black carbon and global warming. Black carbon is commonly known as soot. Dr. Bond, I'd like to hear from you.
Chairman Waxman, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee, I've spent the last 12 years modeling and measuring sources of black carbon, and I'm pleased to share my expertise about the role of black carbon in climate change.
It is like anything black. It absorbs sunlight and turns it into heat. You can feel that happening when you walk across a hot parking lot on a sunny day. It will take sunlight and turn it into heat, warm the atmosphere, or if it's sitting on snow, it'll melt the snow.
We will now continue examining black carbon's effect on climate change.
Well, black carbon comes out from basically inefficient combustion. And so if you have an inefficient engine, it'll put out little black particles, which some people call soot, some call black carbon. They get into the atmosphere, they can get blown by the winds, and they get deposited into areas where there is snowing and glaciers, and it will increase the absorption of solar radiation there, and that'll create warming that tends to melt the ice and the snow.
Our best guess of the sources of black carbon is there's quite a lot from open burning of forests and savannas. It's about 40 to 50% of the global emissions. There's about 20 to 25% from household combustion of solid fuel, so that would be people cooking with wood and coal. And there's about 20 to 25% from diesel engines. There's a small contribution from industry, particularly in countries where the technology is not as strong and emission controls are not in place.
Another interesting and complicated part of the problem is what does happen to the soot once it lands on the snow. If you think about it, the snow starting to melt, you would think that they would get washed down through the snow layer with the water and disappear. There's some indication that the black carbon particles don't absorb water. They're what we call hydrophobic, so that when the snow starts to melt, they're actually left behind on the surface of the snow, which would make their impact even stronger because you would have a concentration of the black particles at the surface. And so in that sense, you may have an amplification of the effect, and it would basically continue to affect the reflectivity of the snow and how warm it gets for as long as it sits up at the surface.
Can you tell us what the global warming potential is of black carbon?
The global warming potential of black carbon over 100 years is about 680. That means that for 1 pound of black carbon put in the atmosphere, you get 680 times as much energy added to the atmosphere as if you put in a pound of CO2.
Supreme Master Television interviewed Brazilian researchers via email to learn more about their studies of black carbon's role in melting Antarctica's hotspots, and learned that although the research is still in its infancy, they have found links between Latin America's livestock industry and this process. Dr. Heitor Evangelista, Deputy Head of Department of Biophysics and Biometry at the State University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, stated,
"We have measured from the South Atlantic, or Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to the Antarctic Peninsula over several years. Black carbon has been detected in several stations around Antarctica and at the South Pole. Higher values are found in the Antarctic Peninsula, probably due to the shorter distance to South America. But a similar process as that observed in Greenland was not already observed, not because it had never occurred, but because very few experiments were conducted. Also, we have modeled the dispersion of black carbon to Antarctica, and we have concluded that around 60% of the black carbon measured at the Antarctic Peninsula derives from South America, mainly events of biomass burning in central Brazil. The largest amount of biomass burning in South America occurs in Brazil. It is not only due to deforestation, but also from pasture regions and sugarcane plantations. People deforest, remove commercial wood, and put fire to the rest. Paraguay, northern Argentina, and Bolivia also contribute to that. Also, around 30% of the black carbon apportioning in the Antarctic Peninsula comes from Africa, and we do not have much data on these emissions."
The nonprofit environmental group Greenpeace International estimates that 80% of the Brazilian Amazon rainforest area destroyed between 1996 and 2006 was used to create pasture for cattle grazing. Professor John Broder, author of Rainforest Cities, Urbanization, Development, and Globalization of the Brazilian Amazon, and professor of urban planning at Virginia Tech University in the USA, spoke with Supreme Master Television on the role of livestock production in destroying the Amazon region.
What is driving deforestation now in the Amazon are three things. And first and most important is the expansion of the livestock sector over the past 10 years. And by livestock, I mean cattle, beef cattle industry. And I, for years, have been trying to figure out a mathematical model for predicting change, and I finally come up with a very simple one, that deforestation rates are going to be high. They're going to depend on two things. One, the price of beef products in the European market times the population density of the municipio in the producing supply region. We have not tested that, but it really comes down to basically beef and how much available forest lands within proximity of a transport node. Two other drivers that I had, apart from cattle, is soybeans, and after that, sugarcane. But what the corporations are sometimes doing is alternating between pasture and soybeans. Soy is a legume. It fixes nitrogen in the soils that are sometimes converted then to pasture and heavily used for that purpose.
Where does the burning of the biomass come into the agricultural production cycle there?
Well, to clear forest, you have to cut it down, and then you have to let it dry, and then you burn it. So in the southwestern Amazon, southern Amazon, most deforestation occurs at the end of the rainy season, which is April, May, about this time. The cut slash is left on the ground through the dry season from about this time to when the rainy season resumes. During that time, the slash dries, and then it's burned on the ground starting in August, which is called the burning season. So I've experienced some unbelievable forest slash burning events in my field work in the Amazon. Routinely, the national airport at Porto Velho, the capital city of Rondônia, during the burning season is closed because visibility does not permit landings and takeoffs. It's been so thick that you would think that you would need a ventilator outside to breathe. It's been so thick that you would think it was the middle of the night because it's blocking out the sun even though it's high noon.
Is it burned off once a year, or is it just whenever they're doing new deforestation?
Areas that have been cleared of primary forest but then abandoned after several years, and there's regrowth. A lot of the forest burning is from secondary forest. Probably most of it is, I would say, rather than primary forest at this point.
The Food and Agriculture Organization found that 9% of human-caused CO2 released is from livestock raising, with the majority of this 9% coming from land use changes. The activities that are driving such changes are things like the deforestation of the Amazon to make space for cattle to graze, as well as to create fields for cultivation of animal feed. Livestock's Long Shadow also concluded that the livestock sector is the single largest source of anthropogenic or human-induced methane on the planet, accounting for 37% of the gas. In the context of factory farming, methane is created from animal manure and from the digestion process of ruminant animals such as sheep, goats, and cows. Among other sources, nitrous oxide is released by animal manure and synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, which are currently in use in non-organic farm settings. The Food and Agriculture Organization calculated that the livestock sector is responsible for 67% of all human-induced nitrous oxide emissions. Nitrous oxide has 296 times the global warming potential of CO2. Since this report came out, the pace of climate destabilization has accelerated, and governments around the world are searching for answers. We know that in addition to CO2 and other long-lived gases, in the near future, a reduction of shorter-lived greenhouse gases like methane and ozone, along with lessening of the release of black carbon or soot into the atmosphere, is imperative for cooling and for the very survival on the planet. Preliminary research in Antarctica suggests at least the Antarctic Peninsula, which is one of the faster melting areas of Antarctica, is being affected by biomass burning in South America, particularly the burning of the Amazon rainforest, which is being razed to create land for cattle to graze and to produce food for livestock to eat. Again, these types of facts have led to questions as to whether the Food and Agricultural Organization's estimate that livestock raising is responsible for 18% of humankind's total greenhouse gas emissions is too low and thus does not accurately reflect meat's true cost to the planet.
Since people found out about this talk that I was going to give here today, I've received a number of emails from people that I respect saying that the 18% figure is an underestimate. It's a low estimate, and in actual fact, it's much higher.
Yes, animals. We know that animals contribute about a half of the greenhouse gas emissions, principally through methane emissions to the atmosphere. We certainly do need to think about the emissions that are coming from animals, particularly when they're intensively housed.
Foodwatch, a German consumer organization that seeks to ensure food quality and safety, conducted a study in 2008 comparing the carbon release associated with a meat-based diet and with other diets. They found that the carbon emissions from a meat-based diet of one person creates the equivalent carbon footprint of driving a mid-size car 4,758 kilometers over the course of a year. But emissions from a vegan diet was found to be equivalent to driving 629 kilometers in a year, 1/7 the amount of a meat-based diet, or 87% less than a meat and dairy-centered diet. The biggest savings by far was an organic vegan diet, which is the equivalent of driving only 281 kilometers annually, a full 94% less carbon emissions than that associated with a meat-based diet.
I pledge to go veg on Meat Out Day.
Where we are discussing the ways to mitigate climate change and keep our planet cool. Some have suggested that eating locally sourced foods, no matter what type, is an answer to global warming. However, it turns out that research has shown that by keeping a vegan diet, one can reduce her or his greenhouse gas emissions by an overwhelming percentage compared to the emission savings from eating only locally grown foods. This was the conclusion of Dr. Christopher Weber of the prestigious Carnegie Mellon University in the USA.
So basically what we were trying to do was to take a look at how much emissions reduction you could get by buying more localized food, and compare that to how much emissions reduction you could get by eating differently. We compared the average American's diet and looked at, in general, where that food came from and the average distances it was shipped, by what mode of shipment it was made, and calculated how much emissions was associated with that. And then also looked at the entire production phase and tried to figure out how many emissions were associated with actually producing the food that the average American household eats. And as it turns out, production completely swamps the transportation components, such that over 80% of the emissions were due to production, and you can have a much better chance of reducing your emissions by changing your diet.
How much more efficient is it to eat an entirely plant-based diet than eat an entirely locally grown diet?
The average American household makes about 8 tons of greenhouse gas equivalent emissions through their food choices. And we figured out that by shifting to a totally localized diet, you could reduce approximately 4 to 5% of those emissions. Shifting to a plant-based diet, you do that 7 days a week, you can actually reduce your emissions quite a bit from the average, getting up to about 60% below the average household if you eat a completely vegan plant-based diet with no dairy.
Governments worldwide are challenged with the task of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the midst of an economic recession. The Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency conducts research and makes recommendations to the Dutch government regarding environmental sustainability. Their recent study, entitled Climate Benefits of Changing Diet, analyzed the entire meat production cycle and the consequences that would follow if people modified the types of food they chose to eat. It also calculated the monetary cost of halting climate change, which was defined as a goal of stabilizing atmospheric CO2 at a level 50% of 450 parts per million. The report concluded that 20 trillion US dollars, or 50% of a total 40 trillion US dollars, the total estimated cost to achieve the goal, could be saved if there was a global shift to a low-meat diet. Department Director Dr. Joep Oud Louise gave further details in a phone interview with Supreme Master Television. One question he answered was, what would be the effect on the goal in the case of everyone transitioning to a completely meat-free diet?
If you would go for a completely meatless diet in the next 10 to 15 years, then in the year 2050 you would have a 70% reduction of attaining the climate goals. That's a substantial cost reduction in getting to the same climate targets.
With a vegan diet, that percentage was calculated to be even higher, 80%. Another benefit of ending meat consumption was discovered in the course of the research. It was concluded that if all adopted the plant-based diet, land no longer used for livestock raising could again grow trees and plants that would absorb carbon from the atmosphere.
We assumed that the grasslands that were not used by cattle anymore would go back to their natural state. For that reason, several parts of the world will grow forests and retain carbon in terms of more woodland.
To close, the case for the adoption of a vegan diet to cool our planet is strong and clear. May all across the world rapidly take up this simple, quick, and noble lifestyle so as to save our wonderful home.